The Rules Committee will come to order. We're here for consideration of the H.R. 2560, the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act of 2011. We're happy to welcome Mr. Chaffetz from Utah, and we're awaiting the arrival of Mr. Van Hollen. So without objection, any prepared statement that you have will appear in the record in its entirety, and we welcome your summary.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here. These are monumental times. The tasks before us are immense.
I think it's on.
Yeah.
Yep, it's working.
Okay. The tasks before us are monumental. I think, have given a great deal of discussion to the idea that this country is in deep financial trouble. We are looking at a debt ceiling that is quickly arising. That date, August 2nd, is very real. We recognize that. With all of these discussions that have been ongoing, there needs to be a plan. There needs to be an actual way to deal with the debt ceiling situation. And so we have offered a bill here called Cut, Cap, and Balance, which does three basic things. Immediate cuts in the coming fiscal year that account for about $111 billion based on the CBO baseline. Put a cap on spending over the course of time, a glide path that will bring down as a percentage of GDP down to about 19.9% of our gross domestic product. That, as a statutory cap, I think will have an impact. It doesn't specify which programs to cut. It doesn't say which programs we're going to keep. What it does say to future Congress is we need to live within our means, and we're going to have to figure out how, each and every year, what we're going to prioritize and what we're going to prioritize over other things. And the third part that it does, which is probably the most important item, is to move a balanced budget amendment to the states. All that we ask in this bill is that we simply allow the states to weigh in should the federal government live under a balanced budget amendment. Should they do that? And a constitutional amendment is obviously the strongest. Now, you'll hear some people say, well, we don't need that. We just need to do our jobs. Now, Congresses have shown on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democratic administrations, Republican and Democratic Congresses, that we haven't been able to live within our means. And so the core of what we're trying to do here is to suggest that if we're able to move to the states a balanced budget amendment, that we would then raise the debt ceiling. Now, there are a lot of us here that have no desire, did not come here to raise the debt ceiling. But what I did come here to do is help solve the underlying problem. And if we don't solve the underlying problem, then we will have not made the progress that we said and we made commitments to do. And so that's the essence of what Cut, Cap, and Balance is about. And I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I urge you to bring to the floor a piece of legislation that meets two principles. One principle is that the United States pays its debts. It pays its bills, and that we shouldn't hold the entire economy hostage by threats that we're not going to fulfill those obligations. I know many people said at one point that Secretary Geithner was cooking the books and they were crying wolf. We've now heard from Standard & Poor's, we've heard from Moody's, we've heard from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The reality is that if we do not pay our debts, the United States economy will take a huge hit. We will see interest rates go up. That will hurt every American family trying to make car payments, pay mortgages, and across the board. So it's irresponsible to make demands stating that if we don't get something else done 100% our way, we're prepared to tank the economy and threaten lots of jobs. And I would point out, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about this, that we have to raise our debt ceiling to pay for things that we've already acquired. These are for obligations already incurred. These are for the wars that the United States is engaged in. This is to help pay for Part D of Medicare prescription drug bill, which when it was passed in 2005 had no pay for. This is because of the fact that the revenues coming in are not sufficient to meet our obligations, and a good part of that reason is that in 2001, 2003, we enacted tax cuts that disproportionately benefited the very wealthy. So that's why there are somewhat fewer revenues coming in, on top, of course, of a very fragile economy. Let's not make that fragile economy worse, number one. Number two, I would hope we would take a balanced approach to reducing the deficit and debt. On the Budget Committee, I think there's broad consensus that this is a major challenge for our country. We do have a difference of opinion in how we go about doing it. The President, in fact, has put on the table a proposal that borrows from the framework of the bipartisan Simpson-Bowles proposal, doesn't accept every deal, but accepts the framework, which says that we will cut $3 for every $1 in revenue, and proposes to raise revenue by closing a lot of corporate loopholes, ending the subsidies for the oil and gas industry, and asking the folks at the very top of the income scale to go back to the rates they were paying during the Clinton years, a time when the economy was booming and 20 million jobs were created. The problem with the proposal before us is it takes a totally unbalanced approach. And let's make no mistake, this is no garden variety balanced budget amendment. This has a couple of huge twists in it that would essentially write into the Constitution of the United States procedures to enact the Republican budget plan, a plan that ends the Medicare guarantee, slashes Medicaid, cuts education, and protects special interest tax breaks. Why do I say that? Well, it's right in here. It's right in here. Under this amendment that would be implanted in the Constitution of the United States, in the Constitution of the United States, if I finish?
Holland, and we'll engage in questions when we're done.
In the Constitution of the United States, you would need a majority vote to slash Medicare or slash Medicaid. You would need a two-thirds vote to close corporate tax loopholes. You are going to write into the Constitution of the United States a preference for cutting Medicare to beneficiaries who have median incomes of $22,000, preference for cutting that over ending subsidies for oil and gas industries. In the Constitution of the United States, you're going to write into the Constitution of the United States a provision that makes it easy to create special interest tax loopholes. Every Washington lobbyist has been working hard to get a lot of corporate pork barrel into the tax code. Make it easy to do that, but hard for reformers to close it. Why? Because by a majority vote, you can create a new tax loophole, but it requires two-thirds vote to shut it down. We'd be writing that into the Constitution. The other device in here to ensure that the Constitution is biased towards implementing the Republican budget plan is the cap on 18% expenditures, which is at least what's in the constitutional amendment that was voted out of the Judiciary Committee. I don't know exactly what will be brought to the floor, but that's the one that's come out of the Judiciary Committee. That sets a cap of 18%. The United States has not hit that level of cap since approximately 1966. With the growing number of baby boomers who are retiring, who are going to be eligible for Medicare and Social Security, putting that cap in guarantees deep cuts to those and other programs. So make no mistake, this is a very twisted version of a balanced budget amendment. We keep hearing that 49 of 50 states have balanced budget amendments. I serve in the Maryland legislature. We have to have a balanced budget. But very few states write into their founding document, into their state constitutions, a bias in favor of tax loopholes with respect to their decision making, and very few write into their state constitutions a cap based on the percentage of their state economy. So let's be really clear. This is a document, it's dressed up like a balanced budget amendment, but it will manipulate the Constitution of the United States to essentially implement the priorities of the Republican budget. And that's why I think it is so wrong-headed, and I'll end with this, Mr. Chairman. What's really toxic about this proposal, it ties those two things together. It says, unless you pass this sort of twisted version of an amendment to the Constitution, unless you pass that, we're going to allow the United States to default on its obligations. Unless you pass this manipulation of the Constitution, we're not going to let the United States pay its bills, and we're going to let the economy take that hit and the American people to suffer as a result. I urge this committee not to take this bill to the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Van Hollen. Let me just say that both of you have offered some very interesting points and interesting insight. I think that there's a consensus among most Democrats and most Republicans that we do have a looming crisis. And today we begin discussion of what I believe will be a wide range of proposals that will be put forward. I've just come from a meeting where we've been discussing lots of other options. We know that there are proposals pending in the other body, and I believe that we're going to have to make a decision. And I think the American people certainly brought us to majority for a very important reason. We have 87 newly elected members on our side. You have 9 on the Democratic side who were elected, and I think the message was get the economy growing, create jobs, and put our fiscal house in order. I think that was the overwhelming message that came from last November's election, which saw really a historic shift in the majority here. And in light of that, these proposals that have been put before us are proposals that I think will be discussed in the coming days, but we know that some decisions are going to have to be made. Some very tough decisions are going to have to be made, and we've got to figure out how we're going to get there. I would like to think that we'd be able to do it in a bipartisan way. Obviously, the President is a Democrat, the House is Republican, the Senate is Democratic. At the end of the day, there's going to have to be some kind of bipartisan consensus. I don't know exactly what that's going to consist of. I don't think anyone today knows exactly what that is going to consist of. But what we have before us today and what we're planning to move to the floor tomorrow is one proposal that is there to be considered. And I think it's going to be an interesting debate, and it's my hope that we'll have that this committee will make an order lots of time for there to be discussion, for both sides to make arguments, and at the end of the day, we will have a vote and see where it stands. So I have no questions for either of you, but do very much appreciate the thoughtful approach that both of you have taken to dealing with what is obviously a very important issue. Ms. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have several questions I would like to ask and some comments to make. I think I'll start with questioning. I'd like to ask Mr. Chavis, Mr. Van Hollen kept talking about how irresponsible it would be if we did not pay our debts and what a catastrophic situation it would be. Have you at any time heard any Republican, either in the House or the Senate, indicate that we are not prepared to pay the debts of the United States of America?
I think the overreaching goal here is to live up to the obligations of the United States of America, but also to help solve the underlying problems and challenges so we don't keep running into this problem into the future. I think part of the reason we're here is that Congresses of past have failed to actually address the underlying problems and challenges so that we can actually solve that. And these 49 states have various versions of how they deal with the balanced budget amendments in their states. But all we ask for is to allow the states to weigh in on this. Allow them to have a voice in this process. Is this what they would like to see us do? Now, I want to help clarify for everybody that there is no specific amendment on the balance portion of this bill. It states a couple of them that are possibilities or something similar. And so that debate and discussion about the specificity of the individual balanced budget amendments will have to come, and come soon, if this bill were to pass, and we'll have that debate. But the very basic premise here is that we want to solve the long-term challenge, not just keep punting this down the road.
Well, let me go back. I'm going to pin you down. Have you ever heard any Republican say, we are not willing to pay our debts?
I can't speak for every other member, but I can tell you as this member, and I have not heard somebody say that we just want to go into default or anything like that. No, I have not.
Okay. Mr. Van Hollen keeps bringing up the specter of default, but what I have heard on our side over and over again is people saying there's no reason for any default. I have never heard a Republican say,
Thank you.
yes, we should default on our debt. But the specter being raised by Mr. Van Hollen and his colleagues always is that we're going to default on our debt. And what is that going to do to the country? I would like to ask you another question. Have you ever seen any detailed plan that Mr. Van Hollen, his colleagues, or the President have given to us for how we deal with this situation?
The only thing that I have seen from the administration and from the Democrats is a desire to have a quote-unquote clean debt ceiling vote increase. And I appreciate the Speaker and this committee for allowing that bill to come forward. We had a vote on a so-called clean debt ceiling increase, and it failed by a huge margin. And I think it showed that the appetite of this body is not to raise the debt ceiling unilaterally without some major cuts and some systemic changes to the way we do business. So we have seen that. But other than that, we have yet to see a concrete, in-writing plan. As Mr. Elmendorf has recently said, we can't score speeches. And that's an important part because there's a lot of rhetoric, but we got about 2 weeks. And that's the urgency. And all we ask for is let's cut some spending, let's cap some what we're doing, and then let's pass to the states a balanced budget amendment, which we know is going to take years to go through the process.
Mr. Van Hollen, I have observed you in lots of situations where when you're asked a question, you very seldom answer it directly. So I'm going to ask you for a very succinct answer. I would like to know a source that every American can go to, that I can go to, for the plan that the President has put out that gives chapter and verse, I think we know what chapter and verse means, on what the Democrat plan is for dealing with the debt ceiling and the long-term problem that we have. So without going into a long soliloquy.
Well, Ms. Fox, I won't respond in detail to your mischaracterization of my statements. But if you go to the President's George Washington University speech, he outlines in detail the major parameters of his proposal. And it runs like this. And it's, as I say, patterned after the Simpson-Bowles proposal, which calls for $3 in spending cuts for every $1 of revenue increases. He makes some proposals with respect to...
Well, let me ask you, what exact increases in taxes would those be, and what exact cuts in spending would those be? Well, we're looking for some specificity. Yeah. You talk about how this plan is so unbalanced. What we want to do is totally unbalanced. But we explain what we want to do. Where are the details from the President or the Democratic side of the aisle on how to come up with balancing the budget in the United States?
Sure. Well, we can talk more about why yours is unbalanced, but I will tell you what the President has proposed. He's proposed about $1 trillion in cuts to discretionary spending. $400 billion of that would be in defense spending. Admiral Mullen.
Can I find those?
Yes, you should go read.
Give me the source.
In his speech and the documents that accompanied his address at George Washington University.
Speech at George Washington.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. All right. So if the American people want to see the President's plan, that's what it is.
That's correct. And then, yes, that's correct. And then in conversations that the President had with the Speaker, they outlined some other specifics with respect to that plan.
But have those been made public?
Well, actually, the President has talked about a number of those.
He's talked about them, but are they
Well, he's talked about them in public.
in public?
But it's
Are they written
it's a
down?
sort of a let me tell you what the conversation ender was. The President has said he would work to continue to flesh out the $3 in cuts for every dollar in revenue. But it's a conversation stopper if there's a refusal to talk about closing tax loopholes to raise revenue for the purpose of deficit reduction. That's kind of like a screeching halt. How do you get beyond that? And
So what you're saying is that what you call revenue are tax increases, because all we've said is we're opposed to tax increases. So you use the term revenue, but we should understand that that means tax increases,
yeah,
right?
well, let me be very clear. Ending subsidies for the oil and gas industry raises revenue because it does increase taxes on highly profitable companies. We don't think that they need a taxpayer subsidy in order to continue to operate. The President's also been very clear that beginning in the year 2013, we should return to the same tax rates for the folks in the top 2% of the income ladder that were in existence during the Clinton administration. And he has pointed out that during that period of time, the economy was booming and 20 million jobs were created. So no one's trying to hide anything. In fact, he's been very clear about what it would require. And as I said, you can't get beyond that conversation because the approach that has been taken by Republicans in the House has been not one penny of revenue for deficit reduction.
No, our position is we will not raise taxes, Mr.
Well,
Van Hollen. And
It's not.
frankly,
It is. You said no, but you said you wanted me to be clear. Let's be clear. Would you support closing a corporate tax loophole for the purpose of deficit reduction?
I'm open to a lot of things. I'm just looking
Well,
for
you'd
a plan.
you'd be one of the first here to be open to that idea.
I'm looking for a plan from the President and from the Democrats that's specific. I find it really curious that you talk about how we want to write into the Constitution of the United States the Republican budget plan, and how you talk about what harm this would do to the Constitution. It sounds like there's no specificity in the Constitution whatsoever. And I just want to point out a couple of things to you that are specific. The Constitution lays out how old a person has to be to serve in the House or to serve in the Senate. It talks about what happens if there's a vacancy in the House or the Senate. It talks about what it takes to override a veto. Our Constitution, which has only been amended 17 times since the Bill of Rights, has stood us in good stead for 235 years, has lots of specificity in it. And yet you are frightened to death of our putting into it something like saying we won't go above a certain amount of GDP. And I noted that you said that we have not hit the 18% level since 1966. 1965 was the year when most of the, quote, anti-poverty, end quote, legislation, I think, went into effect. That was the year a lot of programs went into effect. So it's kind of interesting that you admit that those were the things that probably have kept us from being in balance since that time. I also note that you said that we passed tax cuts that disproportionately favor the wealthy. Well, you know, I think we should start calling those the Obama tax cuts, because it was last December that the Democrats and the President came together. It was actually the 17th of December to extend those tax cuts that you find were so onerous. So I think it's time that we quit calling them the Bush tax cuts, which you didn't do today, but you normally do when you're speaking, and start calling them the Obama tax cuts, because President Obama signed that bill into law. He had no more to do he had as much to do with those tax cuts as President Bush did, because all President Bush did was sign the bill into law. I'd also like to point out to you that even the House rules require a 3/5 vote to increase income tax rates, and that you all, when you were in charge of the House the last 4 years, kept those in the House rules. So talking about our wanting to be entirely too specific and doing damage to the Constitution in some way is really intriguing to me when what we're trying to do is save the country.
Chairman, may I?
And I just think it's really, really fascinating that it's only when we're trying to bring our country's budget into balance that is a real problem. And I would encourage you sometime to sit down with the Constitution and look at all the specific examples of numbers and percentages that were written in by the founders in terms of trying to keep a check on the role of our government. But I just find it fascinating, and I hope you'll go back and look at the rules that you all operated under when you were in charge and Nancy Pelosi was Speaker. Mr. Chavez, I'd like to see if you have anything else you'd like to add to the discussion that we've had here.
No, I'm fine.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. McGovern, I'll let you respond.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. It's unfortunate I wasn't given the courtesy of response from the gentlelady, but let me just begin where we agree, which is that I think the Constitution, with some major exceptions that relate to slavery in this country, has stood us in good stead. And that's why I think we should be so careful about radical surgery on the Constitution of the United States. Now, let me just go back and respond to a number of points that were raised. Number one, the tax agreement that was reached last December was reached when our Republican colleagues essentially held middle-class tax cuts hostage to getting an increase in the top rate. I mean, that everyone knows that was the debate, and the Senate Republicans made clear that they would not support middle-class tax cuts except by linking them to the folks, tax breaks for the folks at the very top. And that's how that came about. Second, with respect to 1965, I think it is instructive, because 1965 is when we passed Medicare, which provides health security to millions of Americans. And it is one of the major points of disagreement between the two parties, because we think that your budget proposal does terrible damage to Medicare. It ends the Medicare guarantee. We'll have that debate. We've had it. But that's exactly my point, was that the last time the expenditures of the country were at 18% were just before that point in time. And if we're going to have that social safety net, if we're going to provide for Medicare and we're going to provide for Medicaid, you can't do it within the 18% cap, which is why you have put it apparently in the Constitution. Because by putting it in the Constitution, you're going to assure that your budget changes to Medicare take place. That's exactly the point we're making. And I want to be very clear, I'm not complaining about specificity in the Constitution. I'm complaining about a particular provision in the Constitution that you intend to put there that, again, creates a preference for protecting special interest tax loopholes, because that's exactly what you do. It's an anti-democratic provision. It's inserting into the Constitution of the United States a requirement that you need a 2/3 vote to get rid of the subsidies for the oil and gas industry for the purpose of reducing the deficit. You want to put that in the Constitution. So I do think that that's a problem. And let me say, with respect to Republicans saying we shouldn't pay our bills, let's be very clear. If we don't raise the debt ceiling on August 2nd, what it means is we won't be able to pay all our bills, because the revenues coming into the Treasury will not be sufficient to pay our obligations going out. There have been some members of the House who have, in fact, introduced legislation to say, let's prioritize payments to the government of China and bondholders over everybody else, over Social Security beneficiaries, over our troops, over all the other obligations the United States government has undertaken. But what economists from both sides of the political spectrum have said is that choosing not to pay one set of bills while you're paying another is going to hurt the credit rating of the United States. It's like saying, okay, I made my car payment, but I'm not going to make my mortgage payment. That sends a very bad signal to the credit markets. That undermines the creditworthiness of the United States government. That's what will happen if we don't lift the debt ceiling. By definition, that means we're not paying our bills. And yes, I've heard lots of Republicans say they won't support lifting the debt ceiling. By definition, that means not paying all our bills.
Thank you. And I just, I'm listening to this testimony and looking at reading this bill that is before us today, and I'm trying to figure out whether this is bad political theater or whether or not it's just throwing some red meat to the extreme right wing of the Republican Party. Because over the last several weeks, the White House and congressional leaders from both parties have been in negotiations trying to figure out a way to get by this impasse. And here we are getting close to the date, and rather than trying to figure out how we can come together, this is a sharp right turn. I mean, this drives us off the cliff. This is not an attempt at compromise, or maybe it's an attempt at, political cover. And if that's the case, I get it. This is a very political place. But I have a hard time believing that this is a serious effort. Bob Greenstein of the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities says that this is one of the most ideologically extreme pieces of major budget legislation to come before the Congress in years, if not decades. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to have his entire statement in the record.
Without objection.
The White House has already issued its veto threat. I'd like to have that in the record. Let me, Mr. Chavis, let me ask you, are you here asking for an open rule?
No.
What kind of rule are you asking for?
I'll leave that to the.
You know it's not an open rule, and I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the letter from Paul D. Ryan, the chairman of the Budget Committee, who basically calls for an open rule with a pre-printing requirement, and you don't favor that.
I think that the gentleman yield. Reading the letter, he requests a pre-printing requirement for the consideration. He doesn't say that he has to. Are you asking for amendments to be made in order?
No, not necessarily. I'm just here to suggest that we bring this to the floor.
You're here representing, one of the committees of jurisdiction. Let me ask you, how many hearings were held on this bill? How many witnesses came to testify?
I'm not. This bill was just introduced last week.
So there have been no hearings, no witnesses, no markup, right? This has just been put together this last week, and
we're dealing with a deadline of August 2nd.
so the entire
and that's what we're trying.
The entire committee process gets thrown out the window for So I mean, this is important stuff we're talking about. We're talking about the future of our economy here.
I wish we weren't in this position. I wish we weren't in such deep debt. I wish we didn't have a looming debt crisis.
This idea that is incorporated in this bill just kind of hit you this week. I mean, we've been talking about this issue for weeks, if not months.
My understanding, there has been broad bipartisan support for balanced budgets in the past.
Yeah, but
Harry Reid has been supportive of balanced budget. Steny Hoyer has been.
We're all for trying to balance our budget. We're all for trying to get this economy.
That's all we're asking.
On the right. That's not what you make it sound like this is like no big deal, that it's just a matter.
Oh, it's a very big deal. It's a very big deal.
This bill cuts total spending by $111 billion in FY12 alone. Requires that the federal spending as a percentage of GDP be as low as 19.7%.
19.9
years. Enforces spending caps with sequestration. And makes raising the debt ceiling contingent on Congress passing a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. So it's not about do we want to get our fiscal house in order, or do we want to balance the budget? Yeah, we all do. The issue is how you get there. And so this is very a lot more detailed than I think that you're presenting in your testimony. I'm just curious. I mean, you know, on the Rules Committee, because we all like to talk about openness and following the rules and regulations and procedures of the House, that it just seems a little bit odd to me that something of this magnitude would come to the House without a single hearing, without a markup, without a single witness testifying. I mean, I'd like to know what some of these cuts would mean to Pell Grants and to the National Institutes for Health, or to our road and bridge programs throughout our states. Do we say to cities and towns, raise property taxes if you want to fix a bridge? I mean, there are implications to this, and there's a human face behind this. And one of the things that troubles me is that it seems, if I'm reading this correctly, the Pentagon exempt from?
If you look at what we're asking in the first year cut.
The question is, the Pentagon exempt? Am I reading it?
No.
It isn't?
No. What we're saying.
Defense cuts, or I thought.
If you allow me to answer,
Yeah.
The cut portion of it is very consistent with what the House passed out that was introduced through the Budget Committee and what passed out of the House. We had roughly 12 hearings on that along the way.
So you're saying that defense
So
cuts are part of this?
What we're saying moving forward over 10 years is that future Congresses are going to have to wrestle with where the cuts are, what gets funded, what doesn't get funded. I think that's the beauty of what we've actually produced here today.
Medicare and Social Security are on the table then for cuts.
What we're saying is that future Congresses are going to have to make some tough and difficult decisions. It does not contemplate, does not mandate one way or the other that Social Security or Medicare gets cut. That's not. It's disingenuous.
Mr. Van Hollen.
It's disingenuous to suggest that this plan naturally cuts entitlement programs. It does not.
Across the board?
Yeah,
Everything?
let me, if I could
Mr. Van Hollen.
respond to that question. And both Harry Reid and Steny Hoyer's names were invoked. I can assure you they never voted for this kind of twisted version of a constitutional balanced budget amendment. And again, this is an effort to manipulate the Constitution to stack the deck in certain ways. It has two devices to do that. One device is to require a supermajority vote to raise revenue. The other device is putting on this 18% cap. Those were not in any balanced budget amendments that were supported by Steny Hoyer and Harry Reid, and that's what makes this provision especially perverse. You can have a good debate on the issue of a garden variety balanced budget amendment. This is not that. Again, what this does, and let's be very clear, is it creates a supermajority requirement to close corporate tax loopholes for the purpose of deficit reduction. We keep hearing this statement that 49 of 50 states have balanced budget amendments. Only 10, by our count, write into their Constitution a limitation that requires 2/3 or more of a vote to raise revenue, because what that does is immediately tilt the playing field. Now, the reason we say that this is a constitutional blueprint for the Republican budget that ends the Medicare guarantee, slashes Medicaid, and protects corporate loopholes is because of those two features. And let me just read you the testimony of Mr. Goodlatte, who is the sponsor of the chief balanced budget proposal, again, this twisted version that was reported out of the Judiciary Committee. He was asked by Mr. Nadler to identify one budget proposal that would meet the strictures of this requirement. Now, the budget that passed the House, actually, the Republican budget passed the House didn't meet it, frankly, because that actually would require us to lift the debt ceiling by $8 trillion between now and 2021. The one that our Republican colleagues voted for still requires that. But what almost met it, but not quite, was the Republican Study Committee budget. In fact, this is Mr. Goodlatte's answer, quote, "Thank you, Mr. Nadler. I would direct you to the House Republican Study Committee budget, which balances it in 9 years." That's the Republican budget on steroids. That budget will require deep cuts to Medicare Social Security, and Medicaid, and education. And when you couple that with this provision that says you need a two-thirds votes, now by constitutional fiat, to close corporate loopholes for the purpose of deficit reduction, you're going to guarantee those kind of terrible decisions.
Would the gentleman from Massachusetts yield a
If I-
moment?
If I can,
I'll yield, let Mr. Chaffetz answer, then I'll be happy to yield to you.
Thank you.
I just want to briefly mention that on page 8, the exempt programs from the sequestration that you brought up, exempt programs include TRICARE for Life, Medicare, military retirement, Social Security, veterans, and debt interest shall be exempt. That's the direct language from the bill.
Mr. Van
If I could respond, that's very false comfort. What that says is that if the Congress doesn't hit those particular targets, which is directed to do by constitutional mandate now, then they're going to say they're going to exempt certain programs. It doesn't at all say Congress can't and shouldn't hit those programs for the purpose of meeting the new stricture that will be written into the Constitution.
Dr. Fox.
Well, thank you, thank you. I really appreciate the gentleman from Massachusetts yielding. I would like to point out that Mr. Van Hollen studiously avoids going to the source, and I always like to go to the source. I want to point out to everyone here that H.R. 2560 shows that it's a 10-page bill. However, page 1 is a listing of all of the people who are co-sponsors. So it's basically a 9-page bill. But also at the beginning of page 2, it has the boilerplate language on it, and then the titles take up a lot of space. We're really talking about probably maximum an 8-page bill, maximum. And if you put it on 8.5 by 11 paper, it's probably a 7-page bill. So it's very short. And what I'd like to do is encourage the American people to read this because it's so short and it's written in very plain language, contrary to most bills. And the most important thing is on page 4, exempt from direct spending limits, which is in direct contradiction to Mr. Van Hollen's comments, which says direct spending for the following functions is exempt from the limits specified
I know.
in subsection C, Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits. So Mr. Van Hollen continues to raise this specter of Medicare being cut.
Ms. Fox, would you like me to respond to that?
Well,
if you would read...
Let me just say, let me just say two things. I'm going to let Mr. Van Hollen respond. One is, it's amazing that such a short bill can do so much damage. And just because it is only 9 pages, as you say, doesn't mean we shouldn't have hearings on it, doesn't mean there shouldn't be witnesses, doesn't mean it shouldn't go through markup. I mean, you know, this is a big deal. And so the idea that, you know, because it's a short bill, it's no big deal, you know, we don't need to follow the regular process, I think is not the right way to go, Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Ms. Fox, if you would read the bill, your own bill, you'll see that that limitation only applies to fiscal year 2012. What the bill does is set out budget targets for 10 years. The only year in which that cap applies is the first year. The remaining years continually ratchet it down. Yeah, well, it's in the section related to the cut, okay? It goes cut and then cap and then supposed this jerry-rigging of the Constitution. So that's what it does. I mean, and so if you look in the Constitution, I would urge the American people not just to read this bill, and I really do urge them to do it, but read it also in connection with the constitutional provision that they've proposed, which again jerry-rigs the Constitution of the United States in a way that favors, well, it favors by definition cuts to things like Medicare over closing corporate tax loopholes. It's a majority vote to cut and slash Medicare. It requires 2/3 to eliminate a corporate tax loophole for the purpose of deficit reduction. You're going to put that in the Constitution of the United States.
So by an accurate reading of the bill, Medicare and Social Security are on the table for future cuts.
Let me just again read, yes.
I think it
This
is,
is
I think
what
it's
they-
important that that point be made clear. Now, if that's something that the gentle lady from North Carolina disagrees with, maybe she should join us and call for an open rule, and we can make the necessary adjustments, when the bill comes before the House. You know, I was reading in the newspaper, I don't know how true it is, but that the Republican leadership, were talking about raising copays on home health care. And it struck me that, that for whatever reason, they don't define that as a revenue. Yet, trying to eliminate the corporate loophole for Donald Trump's jet somehow is something that is an insurmountable thing for us to eliminate. I mean, bottom line here is that the problem with what the Republican approach has been here is that it disproportionately impacts the most vulnerable in our country. It disproportionately impacts our senior citizens, the people who had nothing to do with getting us in this mess to begin with. And yet it exempts, corporate welfare, these tax loopholes that I think by any standard, are egregious. I think there's bipartisan consensus outside of the Beltway that some of this corporate welfare we should get rid of. And yet it becomes almost impossible to do that. It's becoming impossible to do that in the budget negotiations with the White House and the congressional leaders. Why do we got to, the wars? We're not paying for these wars. We're borrowing $10 billion a month for Afghanistan. And yet we're saying we're going to balance the budget by going after poor people, by going after senior citizens, by going after Pell Grants. Let me just say one other thing. People talk about jobs. Sometimes you've got to invest to create jobs. When you cut Pell Grants, it's harder for us to be competitive in this economy. When you cut monies for education, when you cut monies for transportation and infrastructure, it becomes more and more difficult to be competitive. We have to be smart about this. But this approach of exempting, corporate welfare, to me, is egregious. We need to. Let me just finally say this, and that is that I'll end as I began here. I thought we'd be coming back talking about how we're getting closer, and this bill, and again, I'm hoping maybe it's bad political theater, but this bill is a sharp right turn. It moves us farther away from where I thought we were getting to, and I hope it doesn't delay our ability to come to some sort of an agreement between the congressional leadership and the White House. I hope this is not something that further fuels this notion that somehow it doesn't matter whether we get a deal by August 3rd or not. This is serious, and to come before the Rules Committee to bring a bill to the House with no hearings, no witnesses, no markup, something that's pasted together over the weekend, and here we are on Monday to come back and do this when we already know the White House is not going to take it. I just think is wrongheaded, and I really wish we weren't here. I think we need to get serious about trying to figure this out. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being late. I've just arrived on a plane. Mr. Chaffetz, welcome to the Rules Committee.
Thank you.
Chris, welcome.
Good to see you, Pete.
Good to see you, too. I think what's been going on for a long period of time is there's been a debate and a discussion between the White House, Republican leaders, Democrat leaders, but leaders of the House and Senate with the White House. Has the President, Chris, ever put anything in writing about what he would like to see as his proposal?
Yes, as I said in response to a question from Ms. Fox before you arrived, we had a
I
discussion
apologize
about
for being
that.
late.
But yes, he outlined in his speech at George Washington University, April 13th, a proposal which we've gone into some of the components of already.
Is that in writing anywhere?
Yes, it is.
A bill?
Yeah. He also has the accompanying documents that went forward with it. It calls for $4 trillion in deficit reduction over 10 to 12 years. Just for example, it calls for about $1 trillion reduction in discretionary spending, including $400 billion in defense. It lays it out actually in quite a lot of detail. And as you well know, the President also engaged in discussions at the White House with with the Speaker of the House, where they fleshed out some additional ideas. But the barrier beyond which they could not apparently go was the President said, look, I want a balanced approach. I'll do $3 in cuts for $1 of revenue beginning in 2013 by closing some of these corporate tax loopholes for deficit reduction, and saying that in 2013 the rates for the folks at the very top would go back to where they were during the Clinton administration. So, but that balanced approach apparently was rejected, and so here we are.
Yeah. Is part of the offer what the President's been talking about now about corporate jets? Is that to be added to the proposal?
There are lots of corporate loopholes in the tax code that should be
loopholes.
closed. Yeah. I mean, there's no reason that corporate
Is
jets
that a
should
corporate loophole?
Yeah, I think the fact that, carrier jets that carry people get 7 years depreciation, but private jets get 5 years depreciation, I think that's a loophole. It strikes me as something that...
Is it the law? Or is it a loophole?
These are, well, you can have a loophole that's in the law. That's why we have to close it by changing the law. It is a...
So it's the law.
There's no question, Mr. Sessions, that these are laws. The subsidies for the oil and gas industry are a matter of law. What we're asking you and your colleagues to do is join us in closing some of those subsidies for the purpose of reducing the deficit.
Well, I'll just tell you, I think that what we're playing here is a game where the President can speak for the President, and he does. Mr. Boehner has to speak for a body that he controls, literally not one vote. And I know that's a strange thing for perhaps people in every party to understand, but I will never vote for a tax increase. And I think a huge number of my colleagues have, and we've been honest about saying that for a long time. So I think it's interesting that the President's going to test that, knowing the resolve on this side. It was a non-starter, evidently just like what we were saying as a non-starter when we said we would not vote for a tax increase.
Would the gentleman from Texas yield?
I would yield to the gentlewoman and then to the gentleman from Massachusetts.
I think you asked a very telling question of Mr. Van Hollen about what he calls a loophole is actually a law.
Tax law.
It's a tax law. Do you know where that tax law was written in its most recent iteration?
No, ma'am.
It was actually in the stimulus bill, which the President pushed, and which every Republican voted against. So I find it very interesting that the President has picked something to demagogue, which was actually in a bill which he pushed, and these Democrats all voted for. But I thought, since you were pointing out so eloquently that it's a law, that we might ought to explain where the law came from. Thank you.
Ma'am. Thank you for reclaiming my time. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
No, and I appreciate the gentleman saying that he would never vote for any kind of a tax increase or any kind of, and the debate over here is whether or not closing, what some of us regard as a bad law, this loophole for corporate jets, whether or not that constitutes a tax increase. But the other question I'd ask you, as the gentleman knows, I consistently raise the issue here that, we're at war and we're not paying for it. And to me, there is something wrong with the fact that we ask our men and women to go and fight and die for what we voted for. I think we should end these wars, but those we put them here, and $10 billion a month in Afghanistan we don't pay for. How do you deal with things like that if you don't at some point say we're all going to have to pay for it? You're going to cut Medicare and Social Security and pay for it. How do we pay for these things? And that's a big part of our debt problem right now.
Thank you. Reclaiming my time, I will answer the gentleman's question. I have two sons, a 22-year-old and a 17-year-old. My 22-year-old's in the top 2% academically of students in this country. He wants to be a physician, and virtually every physician that he knows is begging him not to become a doctor. So the outlook from a 22-year-old who has studied hard his whole life it's a dream, but may wants to be a physician. Every doctor in this country, how do they get it right that the health care bill that was passed is anti-competitive and a government takeover that will cost 800,000 jobs? How can I justify that too? Well, it's a law. On the other side, I've got a Down syndrome son who's in the bottom 2% academically and will need substantial help. And Alex is going to be competing against all of us in health care, against people who have every ability to take care of themselves, should not look for government reliance nor a government program, and he is going to be in what Phil Gramm called that wagon, what should be a little red wagon of people who cannot take care of themselves by disability, perhaps physical, perhaps intellectual disability. He's going to be in there with senior citizens, should be in there with senior citizens and people who cannot take care of themselves because they're poor. Instead, everybody's going to be loaded in there. You know, the gentleman asked, how can I substantiate, how can I think of all this about the war? There's a lot of things which may not be fair, but they're the law. And we all try and work together, and we should try and work together. And I will just tell you, there's a lot of things I don't like either. But one thing I don't like is people who demagogue or say things that are not true. We're not jerry-rigging, Chris, the Constitution. This is a constitutional process where we're bringing up, and I've read the words, and I don't read where
Will the gentleman yield? Mr. Sessions, would you like me to tell you where they are?
Yeah, feel free to do that.
Section 2. Section 2. This, again, my colleague, Mr. Chaffetz, referenced people like Harry Reid and Steny Hoyer having supported balanced budget amendments. This is not in the tradition of balanced budget amendments that we've seen and debated in the past. What you have here is in Section 2, page 5 of my copy. It says total outlays for any fiscal year shall not exceed 18% of economic input of the United States. When you write that cap into the Constitution of the United States, you will require deep cuts to those programs. As I indicated earlier, the last time, Mr. Sessions, that the United States government hit that target was in approximately 1966. We now have the retirement of the baby boomers. The other provision that jerry-rigs the process through the Constitution is Section 5. It says, a bill to increase revenue shall not become law unless 2/3 of the whole number of each house shall provide by law for such an increase by a roll call vote. You cannot eliminate a tax subsidy for the oil and gas industry for the purpose of reducing the deficit under that provision of the Constitution. You can call it what you want, but you are writing into the... Oh, really? What do you call that?
I call that it sets a standard that is constitutionally sufficient to make sure that what happens if we're going to agree to raise taxes on people, which diminishes jobs, which kills the economy, that we should make it tough to do. That is not jerry-rigging. That is setting a standard.
What I said is that jerry-rigs it in favor of the approach taken by the Republican budget. And the approach by the Republican budget is to cut Medicare, which you could do by a majority vote, and protect these corporate tax loopholes. And this says now you got to have 2/3 to get rid of one of them for the purpose of deficit reduction.
I don't know where it says.
It says it right here. It's in Section 5.
It says to say corporate loopholes. If that's the political term of art,
Well,
you're trying to blame things on corporations, people who employ people in this country.
If I may.
For the first time ever, we're paying out more in unemployment compensation than we're getting back from corporate taxation.
Will the gentleman yield for a moment?
And that is, I will yield.
Thank you. When we're talking about these corporate tax loopholes, Mr. Chair,
Tax law.
well, again, you're talking about picking the winners and losers through the tax code. I mean, the simple question I would ask is when you have a subsidy, does it make any economic difference whether it's on the expenditure or receipt side? I simply don't see it does. If you have if you want to subsidize something and you believe that there's a government priority to do it, you can either do it through a tax subsidy or an expenditure subsidy. They're economically the same. And why can't we discuss railing them both back in the same breath? I mean, they're both the same sort of thing. and we're talking about stopping the government from picking winners and losers in the private sector. Businesses best know how to spend their money to enhance their shareholder value, and the government shouldn't be saying, if you do this one thing, you get some special tax treatment. Yield back.
We wouldn't need them if we had a corporate tax that was competitive with the world, let's say 18%.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I just want to make two brief points. I'm fully supporting a broadening base, lower the rates. In fact, that's what the House that passed out a budget, that's what we called for in the budget. I would work in a very bipartisan way to get rid of some of these loopholes if we also drive down the rate. A lot of us believe that that should be neutral in terms of raising taxes. We don't want to see a net tax increase. Now, the second part, the gentleman was referring to a specific point in a piece of legislation that is not in this bill. What this bill contemplates is that a balanced budget amendment would move forward. Now, that has various different options in there. Perhaps one of the ones that may move forward is the one that was offered by Mr. Goodlatte. But the bill specifically says it could be that one or a similar amendment, as long as it made the basic parameters. So to highlight the specifics of 18% in a balanced budget amendment that has moved through the Judiciary Committee is not necessarily the bill that would be required to move through the House and the Senate.
Just to clarify, if I could, you do require the two-thirds supermajority
In this bill, yes. But it does not require 18%.
In that bill. In other words, any constitutional amendment would have to contain a provision that says you need a two-third vote to do anything on the revenue side.
To raise taxes, yes. But it does not contemplate a spending cap at 18%. It does not say that in this bill.
Well,
it does in the Goodlatte bill. I don't doubt what you're reading there. But in this bill that we're discussing here today, does not limit that at 18%.
Right. You do specifically identify the HRES 1 and a number of others.
As one of the options.
Okay, we'll see.
One of the
All of them require two-thirds on the revenue piece, just to be clear.
I don't think there's any doubt in my mind, I can look at both you and say this honestly, that you are absolutely opposed to anything that would stop the United States Congress from raising taxes to any level that they chose to do with this.
I'm sorry? I think this is a democratic institution, small d, and people should have a majority vote on it subject to the checks and balances of the executive and congressional relations. I don't think you should be putting artificial constraints on majority votes and picking certain subjects to apply that to.
Well, we believe it's high time that this United States government have the same rules that I'm sure almost every state has, because we are destroying this country from this institution and body of taxation and overriding big government.
Just for the record, Mr. Chairman, since we looked it up and we can all research this, but by our count, there are only about 10 states that write into their constitution a provision that says you need two-thirds or more vote for revenue.
Well, I'll be one
That's
that
it.
I can't argue. Gentlemen, Mr. Scott,
Thank you, Mr. Sessions. Just a quick question. Did you serve in the 111th Congress?
I'm sorry.
Did you serve in the 111th Congress?
In fact, I did.
Was the House controlled by the Republicans or the Democrats?
In fact, it was held by the majority party was the Democratic Party.
Was the Senate controlled by the Republicans or the Democrats?
It was held by the Democratic Party.
And was there a White House controlled by the Democrats or the Republicans?
I'm sorry.
Was the White House controlled by the Democrats or the Republicans?
One party control.
So the folks who were protecting the loopholes that are actually laws, the 111th Congress, did not address any of the loopholes that they're calling loopholes this time. This last year it was called laws, was the Democrats.
Correct.
So during that time when they had the majority, 100%, did they pass a health care bill that created a $2.6 trillion entitlement that we can't afford? Did it not take away $500 billion from Medicare?
In fact, the plan which was brought before the Rules Committee passed into law, and this law takes $500 billion away from Medicare, and in fact, the President's on record as saying that he believes there should be substantially more that would be taken. You know, Chris, you and I have been up here perhaps a long time. Mr. Chavis is a relatively new member. I'm glad that he is a part of a breed, a new group of people. I think like I was when I came up here, I hope I still am, and that is that we are worried about this country, and we no longer can continue to do what does not work. And what does not work is taxing and spending and rules and regulations and big government. And so I think that the American people will see this loud and clear, and it will continue to be important to the people of this country. I thank you.
Well, we agree on one thing. We're both worried about the future course at this moment.
I include you in there, as you and I know, you and I are in plenty of opportunities together where we find common ground.
That's true, we are.
And we have never found a way for it to become personal in any way, and I do not intend for it today, and I know that you do.
Likewise.
So I appreciate that very, very much.
I was next.
That I will yield my time to. Thank you for coming.
Thank- Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, when I listen to you, I believe then that there is no possibility that there will be an agreement because there are only two ways to go about this in a sensible way. And you said that, no revenue, you didn't say revenue, no taxes can be considered. That sounds to me like an unwillingness to compromise.
You know, it should sound like, and I appreciate the gentleman, I think he's engaging me. There is a lot of money that is to be gained from the sale of property that the United States government has to go and spur our economy through the use of natural resources. There are a lot of ways to do it other than just taxing someone else. And I assure you, if you go after the oil industry, the energy industry, what they will do is they will raise the prices appropriately for
Well,
consumers,
I'll
and then we'll
reclaim my
continue to
time,
have
Chairman.
we'll continue to have food prices go out of sight the way they are after
Let me
the plan we've
reclaim.
already seen.
Let
Thank
me
you, sir.
reclaim my time. I've been paying light bills a long time, and I don't ever recall them going down. And the same goes for insurance. I don't have a single year that I can attribute that insurance rates went down. And toward that end, I need to make a couple of things very clear here. First off, I invite my colleagues, all of the staff, and anybody in the audience, media or otherwise, to tell me by a show of hands if you think that the measure that my colleagues are so exercised about at this point is going to become the law. Raise your hand. You think it's going to become the law?
Yes, sir.
You got to be crazy. You know good and well that this isn't going to go anywhere in the United States Senate. And
So
you
we
also
just don't try?
Okay, then tell
We
me
don't
this,
do
Jason.
anything?
Excuse me, I'm talking over the reporter. Tell me this, Jason. If it became law, how does it do anything about the short-term deficit crisis that this nation is facing this minute?
It reduces the overall spending by $111 billion. It also sends to the states a balanced budget.
And when would that happen?
Well, that's going to take out place over through the course of
You
time.
got to have a two-thirds majority here. You need 290 of us. You need the Senate's consent. And then you have 38 states that are being required. They meet at all different times of the year. A couple of them are bicameral, don't meet until 2 years. So the measure that you're talking about, if it became law, and let me disabuse you of that, it is not going to become law, and I'll make you a bet right now of cash money that it isn't going to become law. So that said, how is it that this will then address the short-term problem that we have? Even if we passed a balanced budget amendment, it isn't going to address the debt ceiling and the deficit today.
Gentleman
Yes, it
yield.
does. It raises the debt ceiling, something I and a whole lot of Republicans, and I know a number of Democrats, don't want to do. So there is shared sacrifice here because we're raising the debt ceiling, something I desperately do not want to do. But at the same time, it makes a cut of $111 billion, which would make the deficit 2012 over $300 billion better than it was in 2011. That happens immediately.
Do you not that it would require going through the House of Representatives? If you put it on the floor tomorrow, you need 290
Yeah.
votes. And then if that were to pass, then you send it over there to that black hole on the in the other body.
I'll agree with you on that point.
Yeah.
I understand that.
But your $111 billion that you want to cut isn't going to become the law. And if it's not going to become the law, listen, you have, as do all of my colleagues, the prerogative, as I have seen here, when Democrats are in the majority. We had the prerogative to put forward our ideological bent, and so be it. But don't fool or have the American public thinking that what we are doing here is legislating something that's going to address a problem for August 2nd that will cause us either to raise the debt ceiling or cause the world to wobble. So what I've renamed your provision is, rather than cut, cap, and balance, I've named it crap, zap, and bounce, politically. Or I could have done rut, trap, and a couple of other
The only
things.
thing that's going to bounce is the government checks if we keep doing what we're doing. That's the only thing.
I have the time, and I'll be happy to yield to you appropriately, but I will ask you some questions as well. Have you, as I believe all of us have, had a diminution of school teachers and firefighters and police officers in your community? A reduction in the numbers? People laid off, or for all intents and purposes, not hired in the coming year?
As has happened in most every state, we have had to deal with very severe budget cuts. And part of the reason that we're in this problem is that we're spending more than $600 million a day in interest on our debt.
So you've lost school teachers.
Imagine if we didn't have that debt. Imagine what America would be like if we didn't have to spend $600 million a day in interest payments.
How about $10 billion a month in Afghanistan? And how about $1 trillion in Iraq?
Mr. McGovern, tell you there, I'm actually believe that it's time to bring our troops home from Afghanistan. So you're not going to, you're asking the wrong guy on that one, because I actually do want to bring the troops home.
Then tell me, under your proposal, if it were to be law, what would we do about emergency spending? What would we do when we have reached your down spiral in that decade, the number of percentages that you lay out? I think they are 2012, 22.5, and then all the way down to 1919 on the downward glide up to 2021. So then the floods come, and earthquakes come, and the hurricanes come, and the fires come, and other natural disasters. Tornadic activity occurs, and indeed the ever looming possibility of something like 911.
Disasters like that, unfortunately, may happen. You have to be prepared for them. The bill contemplates that there would be a balanced budget amendment, but that would allow for tax increases if there was a 2/3 supermajority. And so I think you would see this country, rally behind the need to support and take care of those things if such a disaster happens.
Well, Mr. Chavis, for your information, there are 2 counties that I'm privileged to represent that still have not received the funding that was promised by us under emergencies. There are people that just lost their homes in the last 4 months in this nation, either as a result of floods or tornadoes, and we still haven't recompensed them. The city of New Orleans is still, after one of the most awesome tragedies, and then followed that by the oil spill, and now we have the man at the BP saying that the Gulf is back. I got news for you. I was up there the other day. The Gulf ain't hardly back. And all things considered, there are a lot of people, fishermen, restaurateurs, hoteliers, all of those people have not been paid. And I can even give you a flood in North Carolina 7 years ago that the money has never been paid. So we certainly, if we aren't paying it now and weren't paying it when we had surpluses, people expect when a disaster is declared that we're going to be able to do something about it. We don't even have the resources to meet that. And here you all are concocting something, not taking into consideration 77 million American people are baby boomers. And those baby boomers are going to hit, starting like last year and carrying on through. And that's going to cause medical expenses to go up. And I might add, I like the baby boomers. They are not going to go quietly into the night. They are definitely going to make a difference. But here's what's needed. What's really needed, and you all keep talking about a plan. Well, the Hastings plan says there ought to be thoughtful deficit reduction, and there ought to be enhanced revenues and taxes, if you wish to call it that. There should be tax reform that would cover all of the measures that we are talking about. And we do need to address entitlements, and we as Congress people need to do it and not pass it off to some commission. We need to stand up and tell the American people what is needed in this country in order for us to go forward. We haven't done it in the past, and I don't suggest that we're getting ready to do it in the future. One final thing. I saw my good friend, and he is my good friend, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, in a proposal a few weeks ago, say that President Obama would get his debt ceiling and we would get our tax cuts. I got news for you, and John Boehner and everybody else. This isn't Obama's debt ceiling. It is America's issue that has been brought to the fore. We've raised the debt ceiling 73 times since 1940. That would be during a war, several other wars along the way, recessions along the way as well. We raised the debt ceiling. The very revered by Republicans and Democrats, Ronald Reagan raised the debt ceiling. I have voted, Pete Sessions has voted, to raise the debt ceiling 8 times since we've been here in the United States Congress. And not once were we discussing these other matters. Were we discussing a balanced budget amendment in 1995 that Mr. Goodlatte offered that got 220 votes? You bet. We were there. Some of us opposed it. 220 people voted for it. But it didn't have these restrictions that Mr. Van Hollen has talked about that are outrageous and absurd. I yield back the balance of my time.
Appreciate the gentleman from Florida. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate being able to follow that because I just couldn't be more enthusiastic about this bill. Mr. Chaffetz, I don't want to blow sunshine, but you've spearheaded this effort from the beginning. You, as Mr. Hastings talks about, folks who are willing to put their ideas out there and let the chips fall where they may. You're pushing ideas that a lot of folks hadn't thought about, a lot of folks hadn't talked about, a lot of folks hadn't figured out a way to bring them all together into one piece. And I dare say that sometimes it takes a crisis to bring out the best in this Congress, and I think you've brought out the best in this Congress in bringing this resolution. I'm grateful to you for it. I want to talk to you a little bit about what your view of strategy is going forward, because I was tempted to take Mr. Hastings' bet that this might not pass the Senate, because just because they haven't passed anything so far this year does not lead me to believe that they still might not pass something going forward. You know, it took the House's passage of H.R. 1, I would argue, to finally bring the Senate to a place where we could fund continuing appropriations for FY 2011. Now, you and I sit on the Budget Committee. You tell me, did the Senate pass a budget before the House passed its budget? Had there been a Senate budget to pass the floor before ours?
I don't believe so. I believe that the President's budget, which went to the Senate, was actually defeated 97-0.
And that vote wasn't even taken until after the House had passed its full budget. So if I go back and I look at history, I see nothing happening in the Senate, nothing happening in the Senate, nothing happening in the Senate. I see the House having a robust budget debate, debating Mr. Van Hollen's proposal, debating the Progressive Caucus's proposal, the Black Caucus proposal, the House Republican, the House Budget Committee proposal, and finally bringing one to passage. Then after some contemplation, perhaps some pressure from the American people, the Senate decided it might bring up a couple of budgets too, as you say, defeated the President's budget and then went on to defeat the House budget. But I don't know where else we go. I mean, what choice do we have, given your experience on the Budget Committee? We could sit and do nothing at all. We could do, as has happened 73 times in the past, simply pass another debt ceiling. Now, how many of those debt ceilings, I would argue, raised the debt ceiling by 15% at the time? How many of those debt ceiling increases raised the debt ceiling by $2 trillion at the time? How many of those debt ceilings were raised, Mr. Chaffetz, at a time when our credit rating agencies say, here are your choices. Do nothing, and we're going to downgrade you. But guess what? Raise the debt ceiling, and we're going to downgrade you too if you don't get the spending under control. You do that. I have to ask, because there's always so much partisan. That's not true, and that's not fair, and I shouldn't say that. We are often able to avoid the partisan rhetoric. This proposal does not seem to be one where we've been able to avoid it. Have you found a single Republican in your conversations about this bill, Mr. Chaffetz, that's enthusiastic about spending 22.5% of GDP in 2012?
Absolutely not.
Not one.
No.
Not one.
No.
I don't know of any either, and I suspect we're talking to two different sets of people. Yeah. Not one, and yet here you are bringing this proposal to the floor tomorrow. Why is that? Not one Republican believes spending 22.5% of GDP next year is a good idea, and yet you're bringing this proposal. Why?
I really do believe in my heart of hearts that there is a lot of shared sacrifice in this, because what we ultimately need to do, the responsibility that we all have on our shoulders over the long course of time, is to solve the underlying problem. And it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen tomorrow. The real root of what we're trying to ask for is to send to the states a balanced budget amendment. Allow the states to weigh into it. It's a very high threshold. We have to get 3/4, 3 out of every 4 states actually has to vote in favor of this to actually have it happen. And so I don't know why there's so much exasperation about the idea that we would send to the states a balanced budget amendment, something that most states live under right now anyway. That's all we're trying to do, is to get the states involved in this and solve the long-term problem so that we can right this ship and get some fiscal sanity back into this country. The reality is that $14.5 trillion, the president has asked to be increased by another $2.4 trillion. It would be the largest debt ceiling increase in the history of the nation. No, that is painful to do. Unfortunately, that will only take us for the next 16 months or so before we're going to have to revisit this again.
I appreciate that. It took a little convincing, as I'm a co-sponsor of this legislation, in full disclosure, but it took a little convincing on your part to get me there, because you're right. I don't want to spend 22.5% GDP next year. I don't want to raise the debt ceiling by $2 trillion. But there are things that are going to happen if we're going to come together to make to guide this country through this section. I'm just so grateful to you for your leadership. Had you not done it, I'm not sure it would have happened, and thank you for that.
Yield just for one question?
I'd be happy to yield to my friend.
No, and I appreciate it. And again, I think we're all for fiscal sanity. We all want to get our budget under control. The devil is obviously in the details, and some of us are concerned about this approach, that it adversely impacts our senior citizens and the most vulnerable. But last week we were debating the flood insurance bill, and the gentleman was on the floor and expressed his excitement over the fact that all the amendments that were offered were made in order, and I said, that I was okay with it, notwithstanding the fact that it wasn't an open rule, but nonetheless, that all those amendments were in order. You weren't here when I raised this issue before, but one of the concerns that we have with this is a big issue we're trying to deal with, and this is a bill that had no hearings, no markup, no witnesses, and we're being told that it probably will not be an open rule. It may very well be a closed rule. And there are a lot of us who are very concerned about this particular proposal with regard to Social Security and Medicare. And it would be helpful if this could be an open rule, and I hope the gentleman will support us in that effort. Thank you.
Well, I share the gentleman's concern, and that's one of the things I was talking to Mr. Chaffetz about minutes ago. We went through a complete regular order process for H.R. 1, one of the proudest moments that I've had in this House in my short time here, voting day and night on absolutely every proposal that came down the pipe, where it went to the Senate to die. We had that same robust discussion on the budget proposals here, voting on absolutely every single budget proposal that any member of this House wanted to bring to the floor, voted on them all, found one that got the most votes, sent it over to the Senate, and it died. And now, if I believe my friends at the Treasury, and I'll tell you, I was down talking with my friends at the Treasury the other day, went down to a debt auction, which conveniently enough is held in Chinatown here. And the Treasury Department was asked, so what are you doing what are your contingency plans as you run up to August 2nd? They said, well, we're just planning on Congress solving this before August 2nd. Well, but what are your plans? Because surely any business operator coming up to a hard stop like that has some contingency plan. What's your plan? Well, we're not going to tell you what our plans are because we just expect Congress to do something before then. That's not my words. That's their words. It's not me who's telling you that August 2nd is the drop dead date. These are my friends at Treasury who won't give me any information beyond that. And they tell me these are desperate times that require some extraordinary measures. I will tell you that any proposal that comes to the floor of the House that raises the debt ceiling by $2 trillion is extraordinary. But when it comes to shared sacrifice, and I think that's an important question, I'll ask my ranking member on the Budget Committee, Mr. Van Hollen. We talk a lot about shared sacrifice and the need for revenues today, and that's the definition of shared sacrifice. But tell me this, if we continue to run up debt, if we raise the debt ceiling by $2 trillion, who is it that's going to pay that money back?
Yeah, that's a very good point. All of us are going to pay that money back, and our children and grandchildren are going to have to pay that interest back. And that's a very serious problem, which is why, as Mr. McGovern said, there's agreement that we need to get the deficit under control. I mean, you indicated that the bond rating houses said you got to get spending down. What they've said is we got to get our deficit down. We agree. We have a very different view on how to do that, and rather than, we can relitigate a lot of that, but we think, for example, that setting up this provision in the Constitution that requires a majority vote to cut Medicare for folks who have median income of under $22,000, but a supermajority to close corporate tax loopholes, raise rates at the top, back to where they were during the Clinton administration. We think they're creating that bias in the Constitution is wrong. Just a minute ago, you said your budget passed by a majority vote. You're right. You guys are the majority. You got it through. If there was a budget under this provision that you want to put in the Constitution, if there was a budget that got a majority vote, but there weren't 2/3 vote for a revenue component, you wouldn't be able to send it over to the Senate. Under the rules of the Constitution that you're putting in here, I just don't think that I think it's a huge mistake to change the Constitution that way.
Well, and that's certainly a debate that we'll have tomorrow. I'd ask Mr. Chaffetz, from where does that provision come? Mr. Chaffetz, I mean, you're a member of this body. You believe in the traditions of this House. There are very few things that have more than a majority required to make them happen. Is there something about the nature of this crisis and the precipice that it threatens to send this country off of that leads you to take this dramatic step?
Oh, it is. We have to understand the gravity of the situation because we're approaching 95% of GDP is what our debt looks like, and there's no end in sight. And so there's a lot of lip service to the idea that, oh, we want to reduce the deficit, we want to get to a point where it eventually balances, but we have yet to see a plan. We don't have anything in writing. So what we're suggesting is by offering a balanced budget amendment and sharing it with the states, an even higher threshold is we got to get 3/4 of the states to agree and to buy into this. So it should be something that this body contemplates very deeply as we look at raising revenues. In other words, raising taxes. That's something that this body should take very seriously, and it should be a high threshold.
And Mr. Van Hollen, is there a Democrat balanced budget proposal out there that does not include this supermajority? Is there a balanced budget proposal offered by one of your colleagues that you're supporting in lieu of this proposal?
I support the proposal that the President put forward at George Washington University, where he set out a plan to reduce the deficit by $4 trillion over a period of 10 to 12 years, and he laid out the criteria for doing that, and essentially it amounted to $3 in cuts for every dollar in revenue, which is similar to the framework that Simpson-Bowles put forward.
Is that the proposal that where you and I had the hearing and CBO Director Doug Elmendorf said, I can't score speech? Is that proposal, or did the President put forward a different proposal?
CBO has not scored the Republican budget either. CBO doesn't score, it has not scored the Republican budget.
The Republican budget?
No, it hasn't.
The House passed. The House
Congressional Budget Office is
Would the
not.
gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield to my friend.
You know, I'm glad you brought up the issue about Obama's, the president's speech. Could he, in fact, submit that in writing to us, the speech that you referred to? Could he actually submit that to Congress to allow us, the House of Representatives, to see that in something I can pick up and look at? Could he do that?
He has, along with the other attachments that fleshed out the details of the proposal.
Has he submitted anything, to your knowledge, to the U.S. House of Representatives in writing, reference to what you're referring to?
Oh, if you're asking whether he made a formal submission to the United States Congress, no, but he made a public speech that was...
Will the gentleman of additional yield for a moment? I would suggest that perhaps if there's no objection, we might then enter the President's speech into the record of this committee, so it's officially in the record of the Rules Committee of Congress. If there's no objection, I'd like to submit that.
Let me say that I've had an opportunity to,
Mr. Chair.
to look at the...
Thank you.
to look at the distributional tables of who pays taxes in this country, who pays income taxes, because what may be lost on so many folks as you talk about a majority vote to cut Medicare or Social Security, of course, Medicare, Social Security receipts come in directed to Social Security. They are directly from the payroll tax. The government has no choice but to turn those around and send those back out. The same with the Medicare Part A trust fund. Those revenues come in, those are directed, they must go back out. So primarily we're talking about other pots of money, but if 53% of the American people now are paying 100% of the income taxes in this country, and that's where we're going to find the money to pay back our debt. If the top 10% of income earners are paying 40% of the taxes in this country, I would just ask my friends to take that logical next step with me, that this is about shared sacrifice, and every penny of debt that we rack up is going to be paid by exactly the people that you want to pay for it. But rather than taxing them in the middle of what is one of the toughest economic times in our country, when we need every job creator that we have doing everything they can do to create those jobs, we're going to have to go back and get that money from them later. But if anyone is under the suspicion that it's not those highest income earners in this country, they're going to pay back every dime of this $14.3 trillion debt, then they need to look at some different distributional tables than what I'm looking at, because I know absolutely who's paying it back, and it's going to be exactly the folks that you want to be on the hook for it. I say congratulations, you've got them on the hook for it, but let's get this balanced budget passed tomorrow. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
You know, when I ran for Congress the first time in 2008, people would ask if I supported a balanced budget amendment, and I said, no, I think Congress should balance the budget, and if they don't, then I think it should be replaced with a Congress that does. In 2010, running again, seeing that Congress hadn't balanced the budget, neither Democratic nor Republican plans balanced the budget, people asked again, and I said, well, you know, maybe it bears serious thought. Congress can't seem to do it without a requirement to do it, so maybe we need to do it. Having thought about it further, I've come to the conclusion now in this Congress that I would support a balanced budget amendment. Just as Steny Hoyer and other members of my party have in the past, I think you would find, in fact, sufficient support on my side of the aisle to be very close to two-thirds of the Congress for a constitutional amendment with a balanced budget that essentially states, I mean, this is a one-line summary and it has to be more than one line, but requires a total outlays not exceed total receipts. That's effectively the definition of a balanced budget amendment. It may have a separate capital budget. I mean, I think most states have balanced budget amendment components. My state does. I think it should be modeled after the balanced budget component that most states have, probably allowing for borrowing for capital projects, just as we do in the private sector. But I support a balanced budget amendment. Now, what's being proposed is not a simple balanced budget amendment. It has two other components that really, in my opinion, render it offensive to our democratic republic, effectively taking away the power of the people in our democracy, namely one that contains a spending limitation as a percentage of GDP. It requires that tax increases be approved by a two-thirds vote in the House of Congress. Now, to be fair, I would oppose any overreach by the other side as well. I don't think we should have a floor on percentage of GDP. I don't think there should be a Democratic balanced budget amendment that says government spending has to be at least 23% of GDP. I would oppose that. because it's the prerogative of a future Congress. If the country wants to have 30% of GDP, if the country wants to have 5% of GDP in government, that's what we elected Congress for. Likewise, under our Constitution, requiring a majority for tax increases, just as we require a majority for spending cuts. I mean, that's what we do. I mean, you might as well put in there 2/3 majority for spending cuts. You'll have some judge somewhere balancing our budget because Congress simply won't be able to do it. I mean, I'd just like to ask the gentleman from Utah, again, many of us in this body having come the journey to support a balanced budget amendment, recognizing that a balanced budget amendment needs 2/3, how is it consistent with the principles of our democratic republic, as articulated in our Declaration of Independence and Constitution, to somehow say that the people cannot elect a Congress that does something that, whether you oppose it or not, might be, 25% of GDP, 23% of GDP, who knows what the magic number is. Why is that a power that you want to take away from the people of this country?
We're not trying to take a power away. We're trying to empower. It's quite the opposite. I see this as something that is done at the state level. I see this as something that people are demanding. I think this is actually a very empowering type of document.
Well, if the people elect a Congress that wants to spend 24% of GDP, I mean, again, who knows what the magic number is?
That's what we're doing right now. That's what we're doing right now.
Okay, well, if they've sent us a Congress that wants 24%, then that's probably what it'll be. You're kind of going
But we're
around.
saying that hasn't worked. That's why we're $14.5 trillion in debt.
No, what hasn't worked is the budget hasn't been balanced. That's what hasn't worked,
I
and that's
agree.
why there's support to do that on both sides of the aisle. Balance the budget. There's no magic to enshrine some number. I mean, what is the science that leads to this? Is it 18? What is the final number it comes up to in 10 years? The percentage of GDP? 19.7?
Well, on the budget cap.
Yeah, I mean,
yes,
what's this-
statutory. On this, and again, there's two different ones. There's the statutory cap, which is 19.9%, but then if you look at the balanced budget amendment, it just says there should be one, but it doesn't
Right.
specify what the actual one is.
Any arbitrary number, any number. I mean, there's no science behind it. It takes the representation out of our democracy. I mean, it fixes it at a certain number. I mean, it's just as
We have several instances.
Yeah.
Several instances where we have different thresholds at different levels. For instance, as I've mentioned several times, 3/4 of the state have to do something to ratify. We would have to, in order to pass a balanced budget amendment through this body, we would have to get to 290 members. It's a very high threshold. And so when you take a dramatic step like that, there are different levels in which we do it.
Well, I mean, the
That's
point is,
history
a
of this
balanced
body.
budget amendment, constructed properly, could very well reach that threshold. But when you're talking about putting fiscal policy in the Constitution, again, there are many people, and I would hope Republicans among them, that would oppose that on principle, just as we would oppose saying that GDP should always be, or the government share of GDP should always be in excess of 20%. I would oppose that, just as it should always be under a certain amount. I mean, we don't, to put that kind of fiscal policy based on arbitrary percentages in the Constitution takes a major power away from the people and the Congress that we reflect.
I guess I would disagree with just that last part of it. I'm encouraged that you're supportive of a balanced budget amendment, and I know you're asking the questions that I'm trying to answer, but my question that I'll ask you on the floor, I guess, is then would you support this bill if it had a different balanced budget requirement in it?
Well, again, there's two flaws with this constitutional amendment component. One is the supermajority for raising taxes without requiring a similar supermajority for cutting spending. Again, they both should require a regular majority. We see how hidebound the Senate is, requiring 60 votes effectively. Can you imagine how hidebound this body would be, requiring a 2/3 majority for I would say spending or taxes? Again, if you want to make them treated equally, I think that's a recipe for additional logjam. And then the other component that renders it unacceptable to most, if not all, Democrats would be to enshrine an arbitrary number, and true, you don't state what that number is, but it doesn't matter what that number is. I would assume, and let me just ask you for the record, would you oppose an amendment to the Constitution that set a floor, that said government share of GDP always had to be in excess of 22% as part of a constitutional amendment? Would you oppose that amendment?
I probably would oppose that amendment.
Okay, and I think, in saying that, you can understand why many people on principle might oppose this amendment.
What happens under this provision is that what we're suggesting is that you have to get to 290 votes. We're going to have to come together in a bipartisan way. I mean, the beauty, I think, of the way we've laid out this bill is it does not move forward. It does not actually achieve the President's goal of raising the debt ceiling by $2.4 trillion unless we do come together in a bipartisan way. And I think that's a good signal to send to the Senate. I think that's a good signal to send to the markets and that we are going to come together and figure out what that balanced budget amendment is going to look like.
Well,
If we don't do it in a bipartisan way, we can't get it passed.
And just in closing, I'd like to encourage our committee to consider an open rule whereby we can craft a requirement for an amendment that musters a sufficient support, and perhaps include some of these modifications that we talked about in the testimony today. I think through an open rule on this bill, and perhaps by eliminating the two components of this amendment that are not related to the balanced budget, we might be able to come up with a balanced budget amendment that musters the two-thirds majority and sends it on to the states. And I yield the remainder of my time to the chair.
Mr. Nugent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chaffetz, how did you come up with, in your numbers, getting to 19.9% of GDP at the end of this?
There are a lot of us that wish that the government would go cold turkey on its deficit spending. The reality is, when we're now having to borrow 40 cents out of every dollar in order to sustain ourselves, it's very difficult to just make that cold turkey. So we try to create a glide path that over the course of the time we wean ourselves away, we make decisions that we understand at the beginning of the process. When people get elected to Congress, we're going to have to come in and hit this target. And so it glides down where we've been north of 24% of GDP, almost 25 cents out of every dollar spent in this country is spent by the federal government. But we want to create a glide path to get us down in that range of 19.9%. And that's just for the first 10 years. That's all we contemplate in here is the first 10 years.
When we talked about, or when we heard about the 18%, what was that based on?
If you look at the revenue to the Treasury over the last 30, 40, and 50 years, revenue has traditionally been at 18%. And so what Mr. Van Hollen, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe what he's referring to is a specific piece of legislation, a balanced budget amendment. Now, again, this piece of legislation, cut, cap, and balance that we're looking at, does not specify that it has to be one particular balanced budget or another. It says it may be this one, or it might be that one, or something similar. And that 18% that he's talking about is, I believe, if I'm not wrong, what passed out of the Judiciary Committee recently after hearings and a vote.
But that's based on history.
That's based on history of revenue to the Treasury.
If we tried to, could we raise taxes enough to meet our deficit spending?
Well, I think this is one of the challenges, and I hope the Democrats would find this as a fair question. They hear a lot of rhetoric, a lot of bumper stickers about corporate loopholes and this. Then show us in writing how that's actually ultimately going to solve the problem, because it will make a difference here and there, and we got to watch every penny, I get it, but how do you actually get to the point where we balance? And the reality is, I have not seen a proposal from the Democrats that ever balances. My understanding of the President's budget that was submitted, which was defeated 97-0 in the Senate, is that he never balances, and in fact it doubles and triples the debt over the course of time. And that's, if you're going to say that you want to reduce and get rid of the deficits, if you want to actually reduce the debt, then show us a plan that actually does that. Because at this point, we have no piece of paper, we have no document that we can debate that says that this is the Democratic plan and that it does that. And if you want to put tax increases in it, that's your prerogative. But we have actually, I think, doing something responsible and saying, okay, states, you look at this. It takes 7 to 10 years to go through this process to get ratification on a balanced budget amendment.
But it's important that we do that.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
If we don't lay the predicate today, where are we going to be if we continue this spending unabated, which appears to be the way we're going, because we can't even get to a balanced budget in the near term without having, we're talking, you hear about drastic cuts, but to get a balanced budget today, it would be draconian cuts. I mean, we wouldn't even be able to live with that.
I think one of the things we all need to fear is the rise in interest rates, because if we have a rise in interest rates now, given the amount of debt that we have, that is going to cause economic hardship at every level that is unprecedented in this country. What was drawn out earlier that we have to be cognizant on is that Moody's was looking to downgrade regardless of whether we raise the debt ceiling. That's going to happen 1 degree or another. We have got to get in our fiscal house in order. I think the imperative is right now. We have to move on this right now. Unfortunately, Congress is a passive punted on this issue. If they get in punt formation, it's time to blitz, because we're no longer going to accept people punting. We actually have to do something. A balanced budget amendment would do that.
If our bond rating is reduced, the federal government's bond rating is reduced, what does that do to every other bond rating in the country?
It's not going to be pretty. I can tell you that. It is going to be very difficult, because we're going to see a rise in interest rates, which is going to affect every sector. And that's not what we want to see. We have got to deal with this. I think the markets are watching this closely, moment by moment. We have an opportunity to do something in a bipartisan way. There's nobody on this side of the aisle that wants to raise the debt ceiling $2.4 trillion. We're trying to do the responsible way, do it in a bipartisan way, and I think this is a fair way to do it. If somebody else has another plan, then introduce a bill to do it.
And you hit it, I know Mr. Van Hollen talked about it, but all the markets, you know, Moody's in regards to their crystal ball, is if we do nothing, they raise, or they're going to reduce our bond rating, or at least where we stand in the market. And if we, and it was mentioned before, if we do it and just do cuts, but we don't have a long-term solution, the same's going to happen.
Yeah.
And my understanding is this, is that if our bond rating is reduced, the government's bond rating, that no other bond rating can be higher than the government's. So if we don't do something drastic and something important to show the rating companies that we're serious about getting our spending under control, not just talk about it, and do it so it, and that's where the balanced budget amendment comes into it, to show that Congress isn't just going to do one of the caps like they have in the past, and 3 or 4 years later they override it. If we don't do something, then they are going to reduce our bond rating, and that's going to affect every business in this country.
Oh, absolutely. I'd also remind this body that we did have a so-called, quote-unquote, clean debt ceiling vote. It was overwhelmingly defeated. We did what the President and the Democrats had suggested. There were, I think, 100-plus Democrats that signed a letter saying they wanted a, quote-unquote, clean vote, just raise the debt ceiling with no corresponding cuts, and that was soundly defeated. So we're trying to find the right balance and solve the long-term problem. I think that's what the markets are looking for. That's what my kids are looking for. That's why I came to this body, and I think that's what a balanced budget amendment does.
Well, Mr. Chaffetz, I appreciate your comments. I just hope that this body can see the gravity of doing nothing. We're going to have to make some, and you talked about it, make some tough choices. I think if you go back to where we were on the initial budget that was passed, the Republican budget, it talked about those issues. It talked about tax loopholes. I'm amazed, though, as I sit here as a new member, listening to other members talk about tax loopholes and all these things that everybody's grinding their teeth about in taxes. They had the opportunity to do things years ago, last year, a year before, and none of that has, come to fruition. And now we're sitting here with a catastrophe staring us in the face if we don't do anything, particularly as it relates to a balanced budget. I yield back.
We still have questions to come from Messrs. Bishop, Scott, and Webster. We have 2 votes pending on the House floor. There are 150 people who haven't voted yet. And so what we're going to do is we've been here for 2 hours. Thank you all. We'll hope that you'll be able to come back after we've got 2 votes, and then we will reconvene for questions from the other 3 members of our panel, and then we'll hope to report this rule out. So the Rules Committee stands in recess until the beginning of the second vote. The Rules Committee will reconvene. We were headed to Mr. Bishop for his questions, and in light of the fact that Mr. Bishop is not here, let's go to Mr. Scott.
Thank you. No, only one question. Congressmember, I'm sorry. On the, Mr.
Like your
Chavez.
optimism.
Thank you, sir. On the $2.4 trillion that obviously we're going to have to work through this year, when we get through with that, which gives us some breathing room through an election, on January 2013, we find ourselves in a worse position if, in fact, the beauty of cut, cap, and balance simply cuts $111 billion next budget process. We find ourselves needing even more money as our non-discretionary spending starts going through the roof. Is that accurate?
It is. We're going to have to come to grips that the debt and certainly the corresponding interest payments are consuming us to the tune of about $600 million a day. And I think people on both sides of the aisle have said for a long time, certainly Simpsons-Bowles, which has often been referred to in this hearing, and others have repeatedly say we need entitlement reform. This bill does not contemplate what that entitlement reform is going to be, but certainly we have got to, as a nation, address it. Whether or not this bill passes, we're going to have to deal with this. But we're also going to have to live within our means, and that's really the goal of the bill.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just had a couple of things. One is, I know we've been talking about the process, the idea of there being no hearings, no markup, no witnesses, but yet on a much, much bigger scale, that's happening with people that don't even belong in the hearing. We have passed over and over positions from a CR to a budget to other things. We've sent them to the Senate, and immediately we began conferring on those without a position from the Senate for whatever reason. I've been in the legislative process for 30 years. I've never seen a process like this one. I don't understand it. How one body would pass a position and the other body would begin negotiating from it. So now here, that's what will happen with this. That's already what's happening with the whole debt ceiling. But not only that, I've never, ever seen the executive branch brought in to chair a legislative committee. So we have conferees from the House and conferees from the Senate, and they meet, and they're supposed to be managing a position. Only one of them has a position, and we ask the executive branch that first the vice president to be the vice chair of the committee, and then the president to be the chairman of the committee, and it's a joint committee. I do not, under any circumstances, understand that. So talk about a messed up process. That's a messed up process. You give the executive branch 2 bites at the apple. One is they get to negotiate the deal. Second is they can veto it if they don't like it. That's wrong. So this bill has had far more open hearing in that we're here. What's been open? As a matter of fact, the president even wanted to drag them to Camp David and have even secret meetings on this whole deal. So let's don't talk about that. To me, I'm very grateful. Member Chaffetz has brought forth this bill. I'm a co-sponsor. I like it. And I believe that every person on this committee in some way or another has said they are for cut, cap, and balance. Maybe it's not the right balancing, maybe it's not the right cuts, maybe it's not the right somehow putting together a cap, but everybody said they want to do something about this problem. So here's an answer. Again, one group, one body putting forth a solution. And what's going to happen? We're going to start negotiating off that position with no position from the Senate, with no even engagement by the President. The second is, and I think this is the most important thing, the best part I like about this is the idea of saying we're going to cut. Because whether it's the little deal, the medium deal, the big deal, the real deal, the Happy Meal, I don't know, whatever it is that's been offered up, $4 trillion, $2.4 trillion, $1.7 trillion, $1.5 trillion, $1.3 trillion, all of those have been discussed. Not one of them cut anything before the election. That's wrong. We came up here to solve the problem, and you certainly can't solve it by waiting 16 months before another election. And so to me, this says one thing. It doesn't say tomorrow or the next day. It says right now we're going to cut. We're going to cut $111 billion out of the budget. It's the right thing. Thank you for bringing this before us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. Gentlemen, thanks to both of you for spending a couple of hours with us. And we obviously have great challenges ahead, about which everyone has talked in the last 2 hours. And you both have comported yourself very well, and we appreciate your being here. And that will conclude the hearing. Before you leave, though, I'd like to call on our colleague, Sheriff Nugent, for a special introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Justin is a Lance Corporal in the United States Marine Corps. I met Justin at Walter Reed Army Hospital right after getting elected. Justin had just gotten there. And I was able to bring Justin to the State of the Union address. And he was able to sit up in the gallery. At the time, he didn't have any legs. And his arm was immobilized, but Justin is one of these true great American heroes. Justin wanted to go back to the fight. He was worried more about the guys he left behind and his 2 comrades who were killed just prior to him. Justin enriched my life, and this is his little brother who wants to be a Marine also. And so I want to thank them. Justin is now taller than me. He was quick to point that out. And he's got a great smile. Justin, thank you so very much.
Thank you very much for your service. Thank you very much for your service to our great country, Justin, and let me say that you're welcome back here at any time. Come in with Bert, and he can certainly show you the way up here. We know that very well, as he does so many others who have served our country. And so thank you very much, and best wishes to your brother, and let me thank you, too, for your desire and willingness to join the United States Marine Corps. I will tell you that my father was a drill instructor in the United States Marine Corps, and I've never recovered from that. And I want to, again, say that it's a great privilege and honor for us to have both of you here. That will conclude the hearing portion, as I said. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us. And we will now proceed to consideration of the rule, and the chair will be in receipt of a motion of the gentleman from Dallas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. By the way, in speaking about your father, he was also an Eagle Scout.
Yeah, thanks. If the gentleman would yield, I'd say that, and he never let me forget the fact that I only got to be first class. So thank you very much. Thanks
for reminding
me
everyone of that.
I should also say that Pete Sessions was an Eagle Scout as well, and his boys, too.
Justin, thank you for being here. Congratulations for your recovery. I know many people, not only back home, but across this country, care deeply about that. Congratulations. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant a closed rule for consideration of H.R. 2560, the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act of 2011. The rule provides 4 hours of debate on the bill, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Budget. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit.
You've heard the motion of the gentleman. Any discussion or amendment? Mr. McGovern.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee grant H.R. 2560 an open rule, and I'd like to be heard on it just for a second. Mr. Chairman, this is a very important piece of legislation in the sense that it impacts the future economy of this country. Not a single hearing, not one. Not a single witness. No markup. Pasted together on Friday, and here it is before the Rules Committee. No nothing. And we're talking about amending the Constitution of the United States of America. And as you heard during this hearing, there are many of us who believe that this bill could undercut Social Security and Medicare. I'd like an opportunity to be able to amend this bill to protect Social Security and Medicare. As you also heard, there are some of us who are concerned about the balance and the fairness of this. All of it is cuts, mostly aimed at programs that benefit middle-class families and senior citizens and poor people. We're going to cut Pell Grants, make it easy to cut Pell Grants, but you're going to make it almost impossible to close a tax loophole to benefit people who own corporate jets. There's just something wrong with that. And so, Mr. Webster, I agree with you that I'm not thrilled with the process of the other body, nor am I always thrilled with the process of the administration, but you and I and everybody in this committee has a responsibility for the process here in this House. And on something like this, I believe that we should have an open rule.
For the motion of the gentleman, vote occurs on the McGovern amendment. Those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. And the chair of the
I ask for a recorded vote.
Mr. Sessions? No. Mr. Sessions, no. Ms. Fox? No. Ms. Fox, no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Nugent? Mr. Nugent, no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster, no. Ms. Slaughter? Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings?
Aye.
Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis?
Aye.
Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No. Clerk, report the total.
3 yeas, 8 nays.
And the motion is not agreed to. Are there further amendments?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hastings.
Mr. Chairman, before proceeding, I'd just like to echo the sentiments that have been expressed and thank my fellow Floridian and good friend and colleague for bringing Justin here to the Rules Committee, and all of us are indebted to you and very grateful for your service. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. Move the committee accept Mr. Ryan's proposal and grant H.R. 2560 an open rule with a pre-printing requirement. And Mr. Ryan wrote to you, Mr. Chairman, requesting a hearing before the Committee on Rules at the earliest opportunity to grant a rule with a pre-printing requirement for the consideration of H.R. 2560, the Cut, Paste, and Patch Act.
You've heard the motion of the gentleman. Vote occurs on the Hastings amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. No. And the committee chair, the noes have it. Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Sessions? Mr. Sessions, no. Ms. Fox? Ms. Fox, no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Nugent? Mr. Nugent, no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster, no. Ms. Slaughter? Mr. McGovern? Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis? Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No. And the clerk will report the total.
3 yeas, 8 nays.
And the motion is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? If not,
Mr. Chairman,
Ms.
could I
Fox.
ask a question? I have read the letter from Mr. Ryan. It does not ask for an open rule, simply asks for a hearing and for us to grant a rule. It's my understanding we've just had a hearing, but he did not ask for an open rule. And I can't remember whether anybody asked that Mr. Ryan's letter be placed
I
in
did.
the record.
Yes, it was
You
placed
did.
in the record by Mr. McGovern, and I actually,
And
if the
yield.
gentleman yield to me, I
Certainly.
thank my friend for yielding. And let me just say that at the outset, when this question came to the fore, I did state exactly what was in the letter from Mr. Ryan. We've just had a vote on this and have dispensed with
Will
it,
the gentleman yield?
and the gentlewoman controls the time. And I just want to say that obviously we are going to have an opportunity for 4 hours of debate on this measure on the floor tomorrow. We know that we have August 2nd rapidly approaching, and that's one of the reasons that we're trying to move as expeditiously as we possibly can on these different proposals that are before us. And I thank my friend for yielding.
I would just say that it makes no sense to ask for a pre-printing requirement and a closed rule at the same time. So whether Mr. Ryan wanted a completely open rule, which I think this implies, or whether he wanted a modified rule, but to have a closed rule and a pre-printing requirement doesn't make any sense. Thank you. Thank the gentleman for yielding.
And does the gentleman yield back? Then let me just say that we haven't had amendments that were submitted to this measure anyway, and we're going to now proceed with a vote on the motion of the gentleman from Dallas. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Pay the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Sessions? Aye. Mr. Sessions, aye. Ms. Fox? Aye. Ms. Fox, aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Nugent? Aye. Mr. Nugent, aye. Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster, aye. Ms. Slaughter? Mr. McGovern? Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis? Mr. Polis, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye. Clerk will report the total.
8 yeas, 3 nays.
And the motion is agreed to, and Mr. Woodall will be managing for the majority, and Mr. McGovern for the minority. We're going to be meeting tomorrow at 4 p.m. on the FAA reauthorization bill, and members should know that we have quite a bit of legislation that is pending this week, and we're anticipating meeting here in the Rules Committee, I think certainly tomorrow and Wednesday and Thursday. We're anticipating meetings. So buckle your seat belts, but have a great evening. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.